Thank you for joining us. I'm Rob Arnott, and I'd like to share with you some work that we've done on what we term a 3D hurricane, the interconnected influence of deficit, debt, and demography. Demography's impact on the economy and on the capital markets is, we think, sharply underestimated by much of the finance community. Demography for us in the U.S. means a slower growth in the labor force in the years ahead. That means slower GDP growth. Slower productivity growth in the years ahead. Why slower productivity growth? Because mature adults are becoming the dominant part of the labor force. Mature adults change their productivity from year to year much slower than young adults. So you've got two engines for GDP growth, growth in the labor force and growth in productivity, that are both going to be slower, and yet we harbor the illusion that the past rates of growth of GDP should come back. They won't. Now, in order to maintain that illusion, we've engaged in an addiction to debt-financed consumption, spending money we don't have, deficit spending, to prop up the GDP. That in turn creates an additional debt burden for our kids and grandkids in order to maintain the illusion of ever-rising prosperity today. And with slower GDP growth, the temptation among our policy elite is to fill in the gap, maintain past rates of GDP growth by borrowing and spending. It's a little bit like a family borrowing money they can't afford in order to buy a car they can't afford. It feels really good, but it's not true prosperity. The impact of this is to increase the deficits and debt and increase the burden that's being passed on to future generations. The impact is most felt in public finance and pensions, notably public pensions, where investment returns are lower, where the liabilities are soaring, and where the reluctance to increase the rates of contribution is a key element of the problem. The solution is actually a very easy one, but it's politically unpalatable. We're living longer, we're living healthier, therefore we should work longer. So age of eligibility can, should, and indeed eventually must rise materially. Means testing, so that we deplete our bank accounts before we deplete our children and grandchildren's bank accounts. Rationing of the most expensive slices of the entitlements pie. These are things that are coming. We have to be braced for them. We have to prepare for them in our own personal planning and for our clients. Now, when we look at demographic profiles of a nation, it's often useful to look at the composition of the population to see where the growth in population is coming. And we can see that there is a very powerful surge of youngsters in the U.S. in the early 50s. The baby boom became a soaring roster of 10 to 15-year-olds in the mid-60s, 20 to 25-year-olds in the mid-70s, and on up to a surging population of senior citizens in the years ahead. Now, the population of senior citizens has been rising very, very gradually for the last 60 years relative to the aggregate population. It's poised to soar over the next 20 years. That's the demographic slice of the 3D hurricane. Japan is in the midst of its own 3D hurricane. The median age in Japan was 22 in 1950. Today the median age is 45. In 2050 the median age will be 55, and 40% of the population will be retirees. Then we turn attention to a comparison of Western Europe with emerging economies, and we find a very different picture. Western Europe is a little bit between US and Japan in terms of demographic profiles and the rate of change, the pace of the aging process. So Western Europe faces a tougher 3D hurricane than we do in the US. Meanwhile, emerging economies, the median age 40 years ago was under 20. Imagine a well-functioning economy and political system made up of teenagers. I can't either. That's why they were third world. They're not third world anymore. They are truly emerging. The emerging economies today have a median age of 29. 29-year-olds are focused on planning how to build their career, planning how to take care of a family, beginning to plan for their long-term future. So the emerging economies are right smack in the demographic sweet spot where the fastest GDP growth occurs. an economy built on a foundation of 20 to 40-year-olds focused on their future. So basically, the developed world faces a massive storm, a 3D hurricane. We've seen early warning gusts and only warning gusts of a storm that's coming our way over the next 10 to 15 years, and then will gradually dissipate. Even in challenging times, it's really important to recognize that there are always interesting places to invest. One of these is to invest away from the 3D hurricane into economies that don't face deficit, debt, and demography headwinds, at least not near term. That means the emerging economies should be a core part of our toolkit in the years ahead. Investing in inflation hedges for the economies that may choose to turn to the printing press to reduce the real value of the debt through currency debasement. Inflation hedges like commodities, tips, high-yield bonds, REITs. These represent an important part of our toolkit. So there are solutions. The important thing is to face these challenges head on and think through how we can invest to weather this 3D hurricane before it strikes. Thank you for your time.